Hi, folks, and thank you for choosing to stop by. If you find these stories relaxing or interesting, it would help me a lot if you'd quietly leave a like and subscribe. Now, let's get started with today's stories. Starting off, we have the case of the Doodler, San Francisco, California, 1970s. The geography of San Francisco in the mid-1970s was a place of vibrant, layered complexity, defined by the contrast between its dense, historic architecture and the sweeping, often fog-bound vistas of the Pacific Ocean and the Bay. The air, cool and damp, carried the distinctive scent of salt, exhaust, and the ever-present, low-hanging moisture of the marine layer. The atmosphere in certain parts of the city, particularly the Polk Street corridor and the Castro district, was marked by the intense, emerging social freedom of the time, creating a nightlife where anonymity and transient connections were common. Between January 1974 and July 1975, this vibrant social geography was targeted by a methodical, predatory serial killer known only as the Doodler. His victims were young, gay men, often sex workers, or those encountered in late-night establishments. The killer's geographical preference was specific: areas of high nocturnal activity and low lighting near the Tenderloin and the waterfront. The method of initial contact was unique and psychologically manipulative. The Doodler would approach his victims in bars or diners, and, during their brief conversation, he would sketch their portrait, a quick, intimate caricature or drawing, on a napkin or a piece of paper. This seemingly harmless act was the final, defining human contact before the violence. The murders themselves occurred in isolated, public, or quasi-public geographical spaces, always in the early morning hours, often shielded by the heavy, damp San Francisco fog. The first victim, Gerald Kavanaugh, was found on the morning of January 27, 1974, on the sands of Ocean Beach. The sound of the surf and the pervasive roar of the ocean were the only witnesses. The geographical setting, vast and open, provided concealment in the dark hours and made the subsequent discovery all the more jarring. The next victims, Joseph Stevens, Klaus Chrisman, and others, were found in varied, yet uniformly dark, geographical locations, tucked into bushes in Golden Gate Park, or on the grass near the ruins of the Sutro Baths overlooking the ocean. The forensic reality of the scenes was grim. The victims had been stabbed repeatedly, often with a large knife, suggesting a frenzied, personal, and brutal attack. The immediate investigation by the San Francisco Police Department was severely hampered by the social geography of the time. Many of the victims were transient or estranged from their families, making identification difficult. More critically, potential witnesses were deeply reluctant to come forward, fearing public exposure or persecution by the very police force investigating the murders. The atmosphere of fear was compounded by the fact that the crimes were concentrated on an already marginalized community. The geographical pattern of the attacks suggested the killer was highly mobile and intimately familiar with the nocturnal habits and isolated spots of the city's park and waterfront areas. The investigation briefly focused on a key piece of geographical evidence: the alleged doodles themselves. Investigators sought the original sketches, hoping to link them to a specific artist or hand, but none were ever recovered. The drawings, like the killer, vanished into the night. The breakthrough, and the great frustration of the case, came with a crucial witness. An unnamed survivor of an attack identified the suspect as a young, African-American man, tall and slender, matching the description given by several others. This witness was prepared to testify, but was ultimately discouraged from doing so by his family, who feared the public exposure of his sexuality would ruin his reputation and career. This decision introduced a profound, uncorrectable fault line in the case. The final known victim was found in July 1975, and then, as suddenly as he appeared, the Doodler stopped. The crimes ceased, leaving the city with a profound sense of unresolved fear and a series of cold files. Decades later, the case was reopened with new forensic technology. In 2018, using stored evidence, investigators were able to develop a DNA profile from the preserved clothing of one of the victims. This genetic evidence provided the first truly hard, geographically independent trace of the killer. In 2020, this DNA evidence was used to identify a potential suspect, Gary Francis Post, a resident of the San Francisco area, now an elderly man. The geographical history of the suspect, his known residences and movements, aligned with the attack pattern. The investigation, however, remains ongoing, defined by the painstaking work of proving the decades-old connection in the absence of a confession. Today, the Polk Street corridor is dramatically changed, its atmosphere cleaner, the transient nature of its population less pronounced. Golden Gate Park remains vast and dark, but the geography of the Doodler murders, the hidden spots near the ocean, the shadowy corners of the park, retains a permanent, cold resonance. The case stands as a chilling testament to how a methodical killer can exploit the vibrant, yet profoundly anonymous social geography of a major city. The cold, damp air of San Francisco continues to hold the secret of the precise moment the simple act of drawing a picture transitioned into a brutal act of murder, a darkness hidden beneath the city's surface. Next story, the Belle Gunness murders, Lockport, Indiana, 1908. The winter of 1908 descended upon Lockport County, Indiana, with a punishing, relentless cold. It was the kind of cold that seemed to compress the very air, stealing sound, and leaving the landscape in a state of brittle, high-contrast stillness. The scent of wood smoke, carried low by the heavy air, mingled with the cleaner, acrid smell of frozen loam and distant, dormant water. South of the town of Lockport, the farmstead belonging to Belle Gunness sat isolated, defined by its flat, expansive acreage and the deep, silent blanket of snow. The property was a study in severe Midwestern practicality. A large, unadorned farmhouse, a substantial barn, and a few outbuildings clustered against the biting wind that swept unimpeded across the open fields. Belle Gunness, a Norwegian immigrant of formidable size and strength, was the mistress of this domain. For years, she had maintained a distant, private existence, presenting herself to the occasional hired man or curious neighbor as a hard-working widow seeking a suitable, prosperous partner. Her means of seeking this partner were unique. Carefully worded advertisements placed in Scandinavian language newspapers across the Midwest, seeking a man of means, integrity, and good character to share her life and farm. The farm, in its isolation, was both her sanctuary and her primary tool. It was a self-contained world where transactions could be finalized in private and disappearances could be attributed to the wanderlust of farmhands or the simple failure of a hopeful courtship. The stillness of the farm was violently broken in the early hours of Monday, April 28, 1908. A devastating fire erupted. The flames, fed by the dry, old timber of the farmhouse, shot up against the pre-dawn sky, momentarily fracturing the cold darkness with furious orange light and billowing, oily smoke. The sounds of the conflagration, the sharp, percussive crackle of burning wood, the sudden whoosh of ignition, and the deeper roar of the inferno, were amplified by the surrounding stillness. By the time neighbors, alerted by the ominous glow, arrived in their horse-drawn sleighs, the house was already a collapsing ruin, an ember-filled crucible steaming in the damp morning cold. Once the fire was contained and the remaining heat began to subside, the investigation began in the debris. In the cellar, beneath the collapsed timbers, the remains of 3 children and a woman were recovered. They were severely burned, but identifiable as the 3 youngest children of Belle Gunness, and what was presumed to be Belle herself. The tragedy seemed complete, a devastating end to a family unit destroyed by accident. However, the initial, routine examination of the remains introduced a chilling discord into the narrative. The supposed body of Belle Gunness was missing its head, which complicated positive identification. More disturbingly, the body was found lying next to the remains of the children, and a local dentist, upon inspecting the recovered dental work, cast strong doubt on the identity of the remains, noting that the teeth were too small for the large woman Belle Gunness was known to be. The investigation into the fire and the identities of the victims soon expanded, fueled by skepticism and the growing sense of something profoundly wrong with the scene. The man who had set the fire, Ray Lamphere, a former hired hand with a documented obsession with Belle, was quickly apprehended. Lamphere's arrest, however, did not close the case. It merely provided the first key to unlocking the true, hidden horror of the property. The next pivotal turn came from Annecy Shootings, a farmer from South Dakota who had been anxiously corresponding with Belle Gunness for weeks regarding the fate of his brother, Andrew. Andrew Shootings had come to La Porte after answering one of Belle's matrimonial advertisements, arriving with a considerable sum of cash and a sense of hopeful expectation. When Andrew's letters ceased, Annecy wrote to Belle, who assured him that Andrew was traveling abroad. Unsatisfied, Annecy arrived at the burnt-out farmstead in early May, demanding answers. It was this persistence that drove the local sheriff, Albert Smutzer, to authorize a methodical search of the grounds. The search began with the pig pen, located near the main barn. The ground here, undisturbed and heavily fertilized, gave off a specific, rich aroma of farmyard decay, a scent that was soon eclipsed by a more sinister, pervasive odor as the digging commenced. Following Lamphere's rambling, often contradictory statements, and relying on the disturbed appearance of the earth, the investigators began to unearth remains. The first body was discovered wrapped in burlap. It was identified as Andrew Shootings, his head severed from his body. The ground, yielding under the shovels of the searchers, became a cemetery of secrets. Over the next several weeks, the investigators, working under the heavy Indiana skies, systematically unearthed body after body. The remains belonged to other men, John Moe, Ole Budberg, and others, all of whom had been drawn to the farm by Belle's advertisements. They had arrived with money, which was never recovered, and vanished without a trace. The total count eventually climbed into the dozens, including the dismembered remains of Belle's adopted daughter, Jenny Olson, and other children whose parentage or identity remains uncertain. The forensic reality of the scene was one of systematic, chilling execution. Bodies cut into sections, often wrapped in oilcloth, and buried deep beneath the farm's deceptively tranquil surface. The evidence painted a stark, methodical picture of a serial killer operating in plain sight. Belle Gunness would lure her victims, secure their assets, and then dispatch them, using her isolated farm and her persona as a vulnerable widow as the perfect cover. The tools of her trade were found among the surviving evidence: an axe, a meat cleaver, and copious amounts of chloroform, used to subdue her unsuspecting victims. The case concluded with two enduring mysteries. The first concerned the headless body found in the fire. Was it a victim she had substituted to fake her own death? The dental evidence suggested it was a smaller woman. The implication was clear. The Black Widow of La Porte had not died. She had disappeared. The second mystery concerned the vast majority of the wealth and jewelry belonging to her many victims. Despite the exhaustive excavation of the farmstead, the majority of the money was never recovered. Did she bury it elsewhere, or did she take it with her in her escape? Ray Lamphere was convicted of arson, but not murder, and died in prison, issuing a final statement that only deepened the ambiguity of Belle's fate, claiming he had merely helped her dispose of the body of a smaller woman, a victim used as a decoy before helping Belle escape. The Gunness farm was eventually dismantled and sold. Today, the land is unremarkable, a patch of Indiana prairie now given over to quiet, modern agriculture. But the geography itself remains charged with the history of its contents. The air above the rich, black soil is permanently associated with the scent of decay and the chilling silence that allowed a killing field to operate for years. The flat, open landscape, which once provided the necessary isolation for her gruesome work, now serves as a memorial to the dozens of vanished men and children, their secrets still buried somewhere beneath the surface of the quiet, productive earth. The mystery endures not as a question of who committed the crimes, but where the perpetrator went, leaving behind the dark monument of her crimes and the perpetual silence of the cold Indiana fields. Next story, The Phantom of Heilbronn, Germany, 1993 to 2009. The geography spanned by the investigation into the Phantom of Heilbronn was immense, stretching across three nations, Germany, France, and Austria, and encompassing a diverse range of environments, from the dense, historical streets of industrial cities to isolated, snow-dusted forest roads. The common atmospheric denominator across these disparate locations was the cold, clinical efficiency of the crime scenes. The focus of the initial inquiry and the epicenter of the Phantom's fame was the state of Baden-Württemberg in Germany. The phenomenon began subtly in 1993, but the investigation did not coalesce until 2007. The geographical link between dozens of seemingly unrelated crimes, which included 6 murders, multiple robberies, and burglaries, was an astonishing, singular piece of physical evidence: the constant, repetitive presence of the DNA of an unknown woman. The crimes were diverse, ranging from the murder of an elderly woman in a small German town to the shooting of 2 police officers near Heilbronn. The most notorious incident occurred on April 25, 2007, near Heilbronn, where Michelle Kieswetter, a young police officer, was executed in her patrol car on a roadside rest area, a geography of momentary stasis along a major highway. The air at these crime scenes was typically thick with the synthetic smell of police equipment and the cold, acrid scent of forensic processing. In total, the female DNA profile was recovered from over 40 crime scenes across Europe. The atmosphere around the investigation was defined by a bizarre, growing sense of psychological terror. The police were hunting a ghost, a nomadic, seemingly omnipresent female killer or accomplice capable of executing a vast array of crimes with total geographical impunity. She was dubbed the Woman Without a Face, or the Phantom of Heilbronn. The key forensic reality was the consistency of the trace evidence. At nearly every location, investigators recovered minute swabs of the female DNA, from the handle of a child's toy, from a broken cookie left in a stolen car, from a drawer in a murdered pharmacist's house, and most crucially, from the steering column and glove compartment of the patrol car where Officer Kieswetter was shot. The geographical evidence was everywhere, yet the suspect was nowhere. The massive, cross-border investigation, involving hundreds of police officers from various European jurisdictions, became a logistical and philosophical nightmare. They mapped the extensive geographical trail, noting the vast distances covered by the Phantom, which suggested an accomplice with an intimate knowledge of European infrastructure and a complete dedication to a life of organized crime. The cost of the investigation soared into millions of euros, and the atmosphere of public safety in the region was permanently degraded by the knowledge of this invisible, ubiquitous killer. The investigation was plagued by the fundamental paradox of the forensic evidence. How could one woman be physically present at so many geographically and chronologically disparate crimes, yet never leave a discernible eyewitness account, footprint, or physical residue besides a trace of DNA? The resolution, when it finally arrived in 2009, was a sudden, jarring correction of the entire geographical and forensic narrative. The breakthrough came not from finding the Phantom in the field, but from re-examining the origin of the sample itself. Investigators, working on a separate, non-Phantom case, noted that the persistent female DNA profile, which they had come to accept as the key to the Phantom's identity, appeared on an unused cotton swab during forensic processing. This prompted a meticulous investigation into the supply chain of the forensic materials. The shocking discovery was that the cotton swabs used by the police laboratories across various German and Austrian states had been contaminated before they even reached the crime scenes. The Phantom of Heilbronn was not a person, but a geographical error of manufacturing. The DNA belonged to a female employee working at the factory in Bavaria that packaged the cotton swabs. She was an unremarked, anonymous worker who had never left the geographical confines of the factory, yet whose genetic signature had traveled hundreds of miles across Europe, linking murders, robberies, and burglaries into a single, terrifying, yet entirely fictional chain of command. The atmosphere of the entire European investigation immediately collapsed. The police realized that the vast majority of the DNA evidence was worthless, leading to a catastrophic loss of confidence and the need to completely restructure the investigation into the original, separate crimes. The Phantom, the most wanted serial killer in Europe, was revealed to be a contamination, a forensic ghost created by a mistake in the industrial geography of evidence processing. The true crime, the murder of Officer Kieswetter and the other homicides, returned to its original, cold status, defined by the real, localized geography of each specific scene. The false DNA trail had wasted years and resources, leading investigators down a massive, geographically expansive rabbit hole, while the true perpetrators of the individual crimes remained close, hidden, and untouched. Today, the scene of Officer Kieswetter's murder is a sober roadside memorial, a geography of pause and reflection along a busy German highway. The air is cold and carries the constant rush of passing traffic. The atmosphere of the case remains one of profound technical irony. The vast geographical mapping of the Phantom's alleged movements was an utter failure. The key to the truth lay not in the European landscape, but in the sterile, contained geography of a Bavarian factory floor. The mystery endures, not of the Phantom's identity, but of the real killer who committed the specific crimes, a secret still held by the individual, cold environments across Europe, their truth obscured by the pervasive, invisible contamination of a single, silent error. Next story, the Mary Rogers murder, 1841. The heat of New York City in the third week of July, 1841, did not dissipate with the setting of the sun. It clung to the cobblestones of Manhattan, radiating off the close-set walls of the boarding houses, trapping the heavy, composite scent of coal smoke, stale refuse, and the faint, metallic tang of the harbor. The year was defined by an anxious expansion, with the city's heart pushing ever outward, leaving old civic systems, including the scattershot, decentralized watchman police force, grotesquely inadequate for the rising tide of humanity. This urban environment, a mix of ambitious commerce and squalid desperation, provided the backdrop for the life of Mary Cecilia Rogers, a woman whose beauty and public profile made her a symbol before she became a victim. Known throughout the Broadway corridor as the beautiful cigar girl for her work at John Anderson's tobacco shop, Mary was a familiar, bright figure in a city often cloaked in grime. On the morning of Sunday, July 25th, the heat was already rising, shimmering off the brickwork of Nassau Street. The sun, a heavy, brassy disk, promised a day of oppressive stillness. At the boarding house run by her widowed mother, Mary informed her fiancé, Daniel Payne, that she intended to spend the day visiting a relative. She dressed carefully, a light, patterned dress suited for the season, securing a lace collar at her throat and bringing a small, white parasol to defend against the merciless sun. She then stepped out into the oppressive humidity and the clatter of the Sunday morning city. That step, from the controlled environment of the home into the chaotic, anonymous maw of New York, was the final documented, certain movement of her life. The afternoon brought a violent, cooling shift, a sudden and severe thunderstorm that broke over the Hudson River Valley, flooding streets and driving all pedestrians to immediate shelter. The torrent was brief but ferocious, leaving the air heavy with moisture and the clean, sharp smell of wet earth and washed stone, a temporary reprieve from the July stench. When Mary did not return to the boarding house that evening, her mother assumed the storm had forced her to stay overnight with her kin. It was an assumption bred of urban necessity, of a faith in the safe constraints of family ties against the dangers of the street. The next day, that assumption curdled into doubt, then fear. Inquiries revealed that Mary had never arrived at the supposed destination. The vast, anonymous mechanism of the city had simply absorbed her. Payne, along with Mary's mother, commenced a desperate search, hampered by the lack of any official, centralized investigative body. Their efforts were constrained to the ferry crossings, the docks, and the crowded, unfamiliar wards of the growing metropolis. Days passed under the oppressive, anxious light of a heat wave, the silence around Mary's whereabouts growing louder with every futile inquiry. It was 3 days after her disappearance, on Wednesday, July 28th, that the mystery took on a new, grim geography. The discovery was made not in the teeming heart of Manhattan, but across the river in the sparsely settled, thickly wooded landscape of Hoboken, New Jersey. This shore, then a popular pastoral resort and picnic spot, was a world away from the commercial noise of the city. Near a picturesque natural feature known as Sybil's Cave, 2 men strolling along the riverbank spotted an object drifting in the shallow, eddying currents of the Hudson. It was the body of a young woman, partially submerged, pulled ashore by fishermen using a rowboat. The scene, damp and shadowed by the trees of the riparian environment, was clinical and immediately horrific. The body was identified as Mary Rogers by a former acquaintance who arrived shortly after the crowd began to gather. The physical evidence suggested a violent struggle. The light summer dress was ripped and stained. Forensic examination by the coroner noted contusions on the body, especially the face, which was swollen and discolored. The wrists bore distinct, rigid marks suggesting that they had been tightly bound, likely during the assault, though the restraints themselves had been removed before the body was committed to the water. Most damningly, there were finger-like marks upon her throat, indicative of strangulation, and a strip of lace, torn from her own dress, was found tied tightly around her neck. Around her waist, a stout cord was secured, leading to speculation that a weight had been intended to keep her hidden beneath the currents. The shock of the discovery fractured the fragile calm of the city. The sensational nature of Mary's murder, coupled with her fame, provided instant, lucrative fodder for the proliferating penny press. Newspapers, unbound by investigative procedure, exploded with competing theories that Mary was the victim of a murderous gang of Manhattan toughs operating along the riverbanks, or perhaps the target of a specific, revenge-driven assailant from her large circle of admirers. The attention intensified the spotlight on the woefully unprepared law enforcement system, whose subsequent actions were driven more by public outrage than by methodical inquiry. The physical investigation itself was deeply compromised by the setting. The site of the body's discovery, the New Jersey Bank, close to the tourist attraction, was immediately overwhelmed by curiosity seekers and the haphazard inquiries of the watchmen. The crime scene itself was not the riverbank, but a location deep within the dense, humid woods leading away from the water. 2 months later, this secondary, critical scene was discovered by children collecting sassafras for their mother, Frederica Loss, who operated a nearby tavern. In a dense thicket, they found articles of Mary's clothing, a white petticoat, a silk scarf, her parasol, and a linen handkerchief embroidered with the initials MR. The ground beneath the shrubbery was trampled and torn up, suggesting a violent, protracted struggle. A trail, consistent with a body being dragged, led away from the thicket toward the river before vanishing. This discovery only deepened the ambiguity of the case. Loss herself claimed to have seen Mary on the day of her disappearance, entering the tavern with a tall, dark-complexioned man, and later hearing a piercing scream from the direction of the woods. This testimony, combined with the forensic evidence of binding and strangulation, supported the theory of an intentional, fatal assault by one or more persons. However, a year later, the introduction of a new narrative offered an alternative explanation. Loss, on her deathbed after being accidentally shot, offered a confession that entirely contradicted her earlier account. She stated that Mary had died in her house, the victim of a failed, clandestine abortion performed by a physician. In this version, the physical trauma to the face and body was a post-mortem attempt to conceal the cause of death, and the body was secretly dumped into the river. The investigation became hopelessly bifurcated. The initial physical facts pointed toward criminal violence and strangulation. The subsequent deathbed testimony suggested a different class of tragedy, a secret medical procedure that went fatally wrong, leading to a hasty, panicked disposal of the body. The city's fledgling police force, lacking the tools to reconcile these narratives, made no arrests. Daniel Payne, Mary's devastated fiancé, added a final, morbid layer to the narrative when he committed suicide a few months later, taking a fatal dose of laudanum near the very spot where Mary's belongings had been found. His final note: to the world, here, I am on the very spot. May God forgive me for my misspent life, was interpreted either as a final statement of guilt or, more widely, as the expression of despair from a mind broken by grief and suspicion. The truth of the final moments remained trapped between the conflicting accounts and the ineptitude of the era's investigative standards. The police eventually moved on, drawn away by the next cycle of the city's endless violence and the voracious demands of the press. Today, the New Jersey shoreline where Mary Rogers' body was found is unrecognizable. The untamed woods of Hoboken have long been tamed by concrete and commerce, and the currents of the Hudson are now regulated by a ceaseless river of modern traffic. Yet, the atmosphere of the original setting, the quiet desperation of the thicket, the cold indifference of the flowing river, retains its metaphorical truth. The water, a dark, shifting medium, remains the final, silent witness, having received the body and held the secret of those final, violent moments. It carries the memory of an unresolved violence, a hidden tragedy forever caught between the turbulent commercial heart of Manhattan and the isolated, neglected wilderness of the shore. The city has grown over the scene of the crime, but the lack of a definitive resolution leaves a perpetual vacancy, a historical echo in the noise of the modern metropolis, a chilling testament to the dangers that lurked in the shadows of a newly expanding world. Next story: the Pembrokeshire Murders, UK, 1985 to 1989. The coastline of Pembrokeshire in the mid-1980s was a landscape of raw, ancient beauty, defined by its towering limestone cliffs and the restless, slate-gray churn of the Celtic Sea. The air in this southwestern tip of Wales is perpetually sharp with salt spray, carrying the wild scent of gorse, damp bracken, and the cold Atlantic wind that scours the headlands. It was a region of seasonal rhythms, where the influx of hikers in the summer gave way to a brooding, isolated quiet in the winter. In June 1985, two siblings, Richard and Helen Thomas, were found in their secluded manor house near Milford Haven. Their lives ended in a tragedy that seemed to emerge from the heavy coastal mist. The house stood silent against the rolling hills, a sanctuary of rural life that had been breached with a clinical, terrifying anonymity. For years later, in 1989, the atmosphere of the coast was again fractured by a discovery on the Pembrokeshire coastal path. Peter and Gwenda Dixon, a couple on their final day of holiday, vanished from the visible grid of the hiking trail. When they were found on a remote clifftop near Little Haven, the clinical nature of the scene mirrored the earlier manor house tragedy. The air in the local villages grew heavy with a collective, nocturnal dread. This was a land of stranger danger, yet the perpetrators seemed to possess an intimate, predatory knowledge of the rugged terrain, the hidden coves, the narrow animal tracks, and the shifting geography of the cliffs. The mystery was no longer local. It was a shadow that moved with the precision of a man who belonged to the soil. The investigation was launched into a world of manual detective work and limited forensic reach. For years, the files of the Dyfpoas police remained thick with reports of a man with a shotgun seen in the peripheral vision of the coast, yet he remained a specter. The breakthrough didn't come through a sudden arrest, but through the slow, patient accumulation of a different kind of record. In the early 1990s, a local man named John Cooper was convicted for a series of violent burglaries, his name entering the registry of those with a predatory history. Yet, the forensic bridge between his burglaries and the clifftop tragedies remained unbuilt. The air in the Pembrokeshire valleys remained still, as if the coast were holding its breath, waiting for the technology of the future to reach back into the past. The narrative of the case shifted in 2006 when Operation Ottawa was launched. Detectives utilized a new generation of scientists to revisit the physical evidence kept in cold storage for 20 years. They looked at a singular pair of shorts seized from Cooper's home, shorts that had a distinctive blue stripe pattern. Using microscopic vacuuming and advanced DNA profiling, they discovered a tiny, singular speck of Peter Dixon's blood trapped within the fibers of the hem. This fragment was so minute it was invisible to the naked eye, yet it acted as a material witness across decades. The atmosphere of the investigation changed from a theoretical suspicion to a cold, scientific certainty, linking the man from the village to the tragedies of the coast. The legacy of the Pembrokeshire murders is held within the extraordinary archive of a 1980s television program called Bullseye. In a surreal, digital coincidence, detectives realized that Cooper had appeared as a contestant on the show just weeks before the 1989 Clifftop tragedy. By digitizing the archival tape, they were able to match the physical appearance and the distinctive, striped shorts of the contestant to the forensic evidence and the descriptions of the man on the path. This retrieval of a forgotten broadcast provided the visual timeline that the legal system needed. The files revealed a man who moved through the vibrant, daytime world of the community while cured a secret, nocturnal life in the shadows of the cliffs. Today, the Pembrokeshire coastal path remains a hub of vibrant life and natural wonder. The wind still sighs through the gorse, and the Celtic Sea continues to roll in, timeless and steady against the limestone. The manor house and the cliff top near Little Haven are once again peaceful, though for those who know the history, the air carries a weight of somber reflection. The truth of John Cooper was eventually reached through the persistence of a small police force and the scientific power of a single blood speck. The story continues in the silence of the Welsh valleys and the enduring safety of the path. The names of the Thomases and the Dixons are remembered by a community that refused to let the mist hide the truth. As the evening settles over the headlands, the cliffs stand in quiet vigil, watched over by a history that has finally found its voice. The waves crash steadily against the shore, the villages sleep, and the names of the people lost stay bright in the collective memory of the coast. Next story, the Brinks robbery, Boston, Massachusetts, 1950. Boston in the late 1940s was a city of deep, stratified stone, heavy brick, and cold sea air. It was a place where history did not simply rest. It pressed down upon the present. The scent of salt, coal smoke, and damp wool permeated the narrow streets, particularly in the North End, a dense, old neighborhood characterized by winding alleys and the close-set, shadowed facades of tenements. It was a place where generations of Italian, Irish, and other immigrant families lived in the intimate confines of tight community, often creating an internal, self-regulating society that sometimes existed parallel to, rather than within, the official law enforcement structures of the city. The objective of the operation was the Brinks Armored Car Depot at 165 Prince Street, a bulky, unremarkable structure near the waterfront. It was architecturally a fortress of utility. Thick walls, steel doors, and small, barred windows designed to resist intrusion. Within its concrete shell, the depot held the day's intake of cash, payrolls, and securities, a static reservoir of wealth pooled from the city's commerce. The air inside smelled of dust, paper, and the sharp, ferrous scent of cold steel and recently handled currency. The conspirators, a highly organized group of 11 men, primarily drawn from the city's criminal underworld, had spent years perfecting their plan. The sheer patience and methodical nature of their surveillance was their defining characteristic. They did not attack with impulsive violence. They absorbed the routine. Night after night, the depot was watched from hidden vantage points, apartments, rooftops, and parked vehicles, until the cadence of the facility's operations became rote. They cataloged the security procedures, the timing of the shift changes, the routine of the guards, the blind spots of the alarm system, and, crucially, the specific combination for the heavy steel vault. Their target was not a spontaneous chance, but a rehearsed, predictable mechanism. The chosen night was Wednesday, January 17, 1950. The weather was typical for a Boston winter, a penetrating, damp cold that made the North End streets deserted and quiet by 7 p.m. The silence of the city was only broken by the occasional sound of a ship's horn from the harbor and the steady, low tick of the depot's external clock. The perpetrators, wearing dark, heavy clothing to conceal their movements and rubber-soled shoes to mute their steps, gathered quietly. Their disguises were simple yet effective. Replica Brink-style uniforms and hats, lending them a deceptive air of authority and familiarity. At 7:24 p.m., the 11 men breached the building. Their entry was achieved with surgical precision through an unlocked second-floor window, where they cut the grating just enough to slip inside. This was the first and most critical failure of the depot's security. A window, overlooked in the final check, giving way to the human element of planning. Once inside the dark, echoing interior, their movement was a quiet, synchronized choreography of practiced actions. They moved swiftly to the lower floor, the air thick with tension and the smell of their nervous sweat mixing with the cold interior air. They encountered 5 employees, men who were finishing the day's paperwork in the counting room. The sounds were minimal. The metallic click of the locking door, the sudden presence of the dark figures, and the quiet, uncompromising command to surrender. The guards were subdued without a shot fired, a testimony to the efficiency and overwhelming surprise of the attack. They were bound professionally with wire and adhesive tape, their faces pressed against the cold floor. The sensory world of the guards was instantly reduced to the feel of the cold cement against their skin, the smell of dust, and the faint, rhythmic breathing of their captors, and the constant, high-pitched thrum of adrenaline. With the personnel neutralized, the focus shifted to the massive, locked safe. The leader, who had memorized the exact sequence, moved to the vault door. The stillness of the room was now punctuated by the soft, rhythmic snick and thunk of the combination lock being spun, a mechanical whisper of focused attention. The heavy steel doors swung inward, revealing the vast, interior space stacked with canvas money bags and boxes of payroll. The atmosphere within the vault was one of pure, concentrated wealth. The robbers worked with rapid, deliberate movements, distinguishing bags of high-value cash from bulkier packages of checks and bonds. They focused exclusively on negotiable currency. They moved with such speed and confidence that the entire process, from entry to exit, took less than 30 minutes. They cleared the vault of $1,218,210.29 in cash and $1,557,183.83 in checks and money orders, the largest armed robbery in U.S. history up to that point. The checks were worthless to them and were left behind. The thieves retreated precisely as they had entered, leaving the bound guards in the counting room and exiting through the same unlocked second-floor window. The heavy stillness of the North End night swallowed them whole. The only physical evidence they left behind was the wire and tape used to bind the guards, the slightly scratched window grate, and the immense, gaping vacancy in the main vault. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the magnitude of the loss. The guards freed themselves and raised the alarm. The ensuing scene was one of immediate, chaotic intensity. The small, contained space of the depot was suddenly flooded with the sound of sirens, the glare of searchlights, and the cold, professional confusion of police and federal agents. The immediate media frenzy was unparalleled. The description of the perpetrators, vague figures in uniforms, operating with mechanical precision, added to the almost mythical quality of crime. For years, the investigation became a cold, frustrating study in minimal evidence and enforced silence. The FBI, hampered by the lack of fingerprints or a getaway vehicle description, focused entirely on the oral tradition of the underworld. They were certain the crime was an inside job, executed by local professionals. The key to the case lay not in physical evidence, but in the brittle trust among the conspirators themselves. The silence of the North End criminal networks held fast for 6 long years, protected by fear, loyalty, and the absence of any immediate need to spend the marked money. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was driven by internal pressure and the statute of limitations. The 6-year deadline for prosecution of the federal crimes was rapidly approaching in January 1956. Desperation and paranoia began to fracture the group's solidarity. Joseph Specs O'Keefe, one of the conspirators, feeling marginalized and threatened by his partners, finally broke the silence. The location of the secret cache of weapons and disguises hidden beneath a car in a Quincy garage corroborated his story. The atmosphere of the North End was forever changed by the revelation. The arrest and subsequent trials, while successful, did not recover the majority of the money. Of the initial $2.7 million taken, only $58,000 was ever recovered, found in various haphazard locations. The rest vanished into the untraceable channels of the underworld or was simply spent into non-existence. The recovered artifacts, the rubber masks, the replica uniforms, the guns, were the physical embodiment of the meticulous plan, a final, concrete testament to the precision of the crime. Today, the building at 165 Prince Street is no longer a Brinks depot. It has been adapted for other commercial use. The interior air no longer smells of cold steel and cash. Yet, the narrow streets of the North End, particularly on a cold, quiet night, retain the heavy silence of the past. The windows of the old building, now framed by modern construction, still seem to hold the memory of the night when silence and methodical planning achieved a spectacular success. The money remains a ghost in the city's financial history, a phantom treasure hidden somewhere within the cold, complex geography of Boston, a final, enduring secret held fast by the harbor fog and the unyielding brick walls of the old city. Next story, the murder of Billy Joe Jenkins, Hastings, UK, 1997. The coastal town of Hastings in the late winter of 1997 was a landscape of Victorian character and biting, sea-blown winds. The air near the beachfront was sharp with the scent of salt spray and the damp, earthy cold of the East Sussex coastline. Away from the historic old town, the residential avenues were lined with tall, imposing houses of red brick and flint, their windows looking out over the churning gray expanse of the English Channel. On Lower Park Road, the Jenkins family lived in a substantial home that bordered the quiet, green expanse of Alexander Park. It was a place where the sound of the wind in the bare trees and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves provided a somber soundtrack to the domestic routine. On Saturday, February 15th, the afternoon light was fading into a hazy, muted gray as 13-year-old Billy Joe Jenkins spent the day painting the wooden windows of the front sunroom. The mystery began not in the dark of an alleyway, but on the quiet, public stage of a side patio. Billy Joe was a young woman of resilience and hope, a foster child who had found a sense of stability and potential in the coastal air of Hastings. She was focused on her task, working with a patient rhythm that matched the quiet of the neighborhood. Her foster father, Shaun Jenkins, had gone to the local hardware store, and the house was supposedly a sanctuary of afternoon productivity. At approximately 3:50 p.m., the silence of the patio was breached. When Shaun returned a short time later, he discovered Billy Joe lying in a state of clinical, tragic violence, her life taken in a moment that happened while the rest of the town was moving through its Saturday errands. The investigation was launched into a community that was suddenly gripped by a collective, nocturnal fear. Hastings was a town where the neighborhood watch was an active part of life, yet no stranger had been seen entering the gate on Lower Park Road. Detectives fanned out across Alexander Park, sifting through the winter brush and the edges of the duck pond, looking for a weapon or a trace of a stranger seen fleeing the area. The air in the house was thick with the scent of white spirit and drying paint, a domestic scent that contrasted sharply with the forensic scrutiny of the patio. The Metropolitan and Sussex police focused on the narrow window of time, realizing that the perpetrator must have moved with a terrifying speed and anonymity. The narrative of the case shifted toward the domestic interior when forensic scientists analyzed the clothing worn by Shaun Jenkins that afternoon. On his fleece and trousers, they discovered over 150 microscopic specks of blood, a fine, aerosolized mist that suggested he had been present at the moment of violence. This discovery became the cornerstone of a complex, legal tug-of-war that would last for nearly a decade. Chow maintained that the specks were a result of a biological phenomenon, the exhalation of blood as he found her and attempted to help. The files of the case became a record of a tragedy that was debated through the lenses of blood spatter analysis and the clinical movement of microscopic particles. The legal proceedings that followed in 1998 resulted in a conviction, yet the forensic bridge remained under constant academic and legal assault. The atmospheric weight of Hastings seemed to follow the case through the courts, as witnesses were recalled and the physics of the crime scene were scrutinized by international experts. In 2004, the conviction was quashed, leading to a series of retrials that saw the evidence interpreted through new forensic standards. The Billy Joe Jenkins mystery was solved in the eyes of some, while remaining an open wound for others, as the jury struggled to reconcile the presence of the blood with the silence of the house and the absence of a motive. Over the decades, the file has remained one of the most polarizing entries in British criminal history. Every few years, a fresh appeal or a new lead regarding a mysterious prowler scene in the park has brought a wave of renewed interest. Detectives have revisited the DNA found on the weapon used at the scene, utilizing advancements in touch forensics that didn't exist in the late 90s. Yet, the high threshold for a legal resolution has not been met, leaving the case to stall in the cold reality of the coastal air. The mystery remains a testament to the fact that while microscopic evidence can point to a moment in time, the context of that moment can remain as elusive as the scene mist. Today, Lower Park Road is once again a quiet, prestigious address, and the house stands as it did in 1997, its windows looking out over the park. The trees in Alexandra Park bloom every spring, and the sea-blown wind remains a constant presence. For those who know the history, the air near the patio carries a weight of reflective awareness, a reminder of a vibrant life cut short in the middle of a mundane task. The town of Hastings continues to thrive, but the name Billy Joe Jenkins is etched into the collective memory of the coast, a landmark of a search for truth that has outlived the era of its beginning. The mystery stays open, focusing on the ongoing search for justice and the dignity of the 13-year-old who loved the color of the paint and the hope of the day. The investigation remains a silent vigil, waiting for a definitive forensic key to break the silence of the late 90s. As the evening settles over the East Sussex hills, the house sleeps with the knowledge that the truth is patient, waiting beneath the layers of history and the shifting coastal sands. The streets are calm, the waves crash steadily against the shore, and the story of February 15th lingers as a quiet, atmospheric reminder of the fragility of safety. Next story: the murder of Daniel Morgan, Sydenham, London, 1987. South London in the 1980s was characterized by a cold, utilitarian urban landscape, with a noise of traffic and the persistent scent of damp concrete and motor oil hung heavy in the air. Sydenham was a neighborhood of sharp contrasts. Pockets of suburban tranquility set against the backdrop of sprawling, anonymous commuter lines and arterial roads. The physical geography was characterized by its lack of natural isolation. Every corner was overlooked, yet paradoxically, completely anonymous. The atmosphere around the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham was usually one of predictable, boisterous activity. Located near the main commuter routes, it was a typical, busy local establishment. The scent of stale beer, disinfectant, and cigarette smoke clung to the heavy velvet curtains and the worn carpets. On the evening of Monday, March 10th, 1987, the pub was winding down, the air thick with the residue of the evening's socialization. Daniel Morgan, a 37-year-old private investigator who co-founded Southern Investigations, was a familiar figure in this environment. He was deeply entangled in the high-stakes, murky world of private detection, with professional connections that range from disgruntled police officers to figures operating on the edges of the city's legal and criminal structures. On this night, he was scheduled to meet his business partner, Jonathan Rees, at the Golden Lion. Morgan arrived for the meeting, a mundane, routine action performed in a public space, designed perhaps to suggest transparency or, conversely, to shield a sensitive conversation behind the noise of the crowd. He ordered a drink, and the two men discussed the complexities of their business. The atmosphere was outwardly casual, but internally charged with the tensions inherent in their work that often brought them into direct, adversarial contact with corrupt elements within the Metropolitan Police Service. The attack, when it came, was swift, silent, and entirely public, yet executed with a chilling indifference to the surroundings. Morgan left the pub and walked toward the small, paved parking lot located at the rear of the building, a space defined by high brick walls and the dim, yellowish glow of a single sodium lamp. The lot was a geographical space of high visibility but low surveillance, a place where the noise of the pub's interior muffled the sounds of the exterior. Morgan was ambushed next to his car, a red BMW. The scene was one of extreme, concentrated violence. He was struck repeatedly and forcefully on the head with an axe. The attack was so overwhelming that Morgan collapsed immediately, his life extinguished on the cold, damp asphalt of the parking lot. The forensic reality of the scene was one of immediate, overwhelming devastation. The air in the parking lot, already cold, was now saturated with the scent of blood and metal. The killers made one deliberate alteration to the scene. They pushed a 5-pound note into Morgan's mouth, a gesture of symbolic violence suggesting debt, contempt, or perhaps a warning to others. They took nothing else. His wallet and watch were left untouched, negating the motive of simple robbery and establishing the killing as a clear, purposeful execution. The discovery of the body shortly thereafter brought the full force of the Metropolitan Police Service to the small, contained parking lot. The intense glare of the police floodlights cut through the London night. The immediate investigation, however, was defined not by its efficiency, but by its immediate contamination. Within hours, the site was overrun, the critical geographical clues trampled, and the chain of custody for evidence compromised. The subsequent investigation into the murder was not a single, focused effort, but a multi-decade series of 5 different inquiries, a testament to the sheer, stubborn impenetrability of the crime. The core geographical puzzle was quickly understood. The killers were known to Morgan and had used the public, yet isolated, space for the execution. The real geography of the case lay within the connections between Morgan, his business partner Rees, and the police. Early evidence, including witness statements and overheard conversations, immediately pointed suspicion toward Rees and several of his associates, all of whom had close, intertwined relationships with corrupt police officers operating within the South London area. The atmosphere of the investigation was thick with suspicion of internal corruption. Witnesses who came forward found themselves intimidated, discredited, or suddenly facing unrelated criminal charges. The case remained cold for years, an open wound in the reputation of the Metropolitan Police. Multiple subsequent inquiries in the 1990s and 2000s, often initiated by Morgan's brother, revealed a pattern of gross misconduct, failure to disclose evidence, and the deliberate compromise of investigations by officers who were allegedly on the payroll of Morgan's business partner. The physical evidence, the clothes, the traces of blood, the details of the parking lot, was all but useless after the initial handling. The only viable path lay through the complex, cold structure of the police criminal network itself. 2 final, major attempts to prosecute the case in the 2000s failed primarily because the key witnesses were compromised or deemed unreliable, often due to their own involvement in criminal activities. In 2011, the prosecution was formally dropped against the final set of suspects, including Jonathan Rees. The enduring legacy of the case is not the identity of the killer, which is widely suspected, but the official failure to secure conviction. The geographical location of the crime, the small parking lot in Sydenham, became a permanent monument to the institutional failure to solve it. Today, the Golden Lion pub remains, its atmosphere outwardly unchanged, smelling of beer and old wood. The parking lot of the rear is just a mundane space of asphalt and brick. Yet, the atmosphere of Sydenham remains permanently haunted by the crime. The anonymity of the London suburb, its proximity to official power, its lack of natural isolation, made it the ideal location for a crime of calculated execution and official cover-up. The true geographical secret of the case is not a physical body buried in a field, but a truth buried deep within the bureaucratic structure of the city's institutions, a cold, hard secret that the indifferent brick and concrete of South London will not yield. Next story, the disappearance of Judge Joseph Force Crater, New York City, 1930. The atmosphere of New York City in the summer of 1930 was one of immense, dizzying contradiction. The glamorous ascent of the jazz age clashing violently with the sudden, brutal descent of the Great Depression. The geographical setting was Manhattan, a compact, vertical geography of soaring skyscrapers and deep, dark canyons of financial and political power. The air was thick with the heat and humidity of August, smelling of street dust, exhaust, and the underlying corruption of Tammany Hall politics. The soundscape was one of ceaseless urban intensity. The high-pitched screech of taxi tires, the rhythmic roar of the elevated trains, and the low, constant clatter of late-night commerce. This was a city where one could be a massive celebrity one day and utterly anonymous the next, a perfect, chaotic environment for a complete personal erasure. The central figure in this enduring mystery was Joseph Force Crater, 41, a justice of the New York State Supreme Court. Crater was a polished, well-connected political operative whose rapid ascent to the bench was viewed by many as a clear payoff for his political services to the powerful Tammany machine. His life was built upon the secretive, overlapping geography of political offices, luxury apartments, and Broadway nightlife. The final known movements of Judge Crater occurred on the evening of Wednesday, August 6, 1930. The sequence of events leading up to his disappearance was characterized by the very anonymity he sought in the city. Crater spent the afternoon meticulously attending to his affairs. He went to his judicial chambers in the towering Granite Hall of Records in Lower Manhattan. He spent several hours emptying his 2 locked filing cabinets, burning numerous papers, and depositing several sealed envelopes and small bags into a safety deposit box. This systematic removal of personal and political records suggests a deliberate, organized attempt to erase the geographical evidence of his professional life. Later that evening, Crater visited a stationery store near his apartment on Fifth Avenue, where he picked up some correspondence. He then met his mistress, Sally Lou Ritz, for dinner at a small, discreet restaurant on West 45th Street. The final, documented moments took place at the former Billy Haas's Chop House on West 45th Street. Crater met a lawyer friend, William Klein, and a showgirl, Sally Lou Ritz. They finished dinner at approximately 9 p.m. Crater stepped out of the restaurant and hailed a taxi cab, telling his companions he was heading to a Broadway show. He was seen entering the cab and driving off into the bright, chaotic stream of Broadway traffic. The geographical point of his final sighting, a crowded, well-lit street corner in the heart of the theater district, was, ironically, the most public and yet the most anonymous location imaginable. He had vanished into the immense, moving, human geography of the city. The disappearance was not immediately noticed. Crater had told his wife, Stella, that he was taking a quick, secret vacation to Maine to avoid reporters regarding a pending political investigation into his finances and judicial appointments. It was not until 5 weeks later, when the Supreme Court reconvened in September, that Crater's absence became a matter of public and legal record. A mandatory roll call revealed the unimaginable. A sitting Supreme Court justice had utterly vanished. The atmosphere of the city instantly shifted from political intrigue to widespread public panic. The investigation was immediately hampered by the complete lack of a crime scene. The geographical starting point was a taxi cab, a moving, anonymous vessel that had simply dissolved into the city's vast network of streets. The police were forced to rely on tracking Crater's final movements through the paper trail he had so carefully attempted to erase. The intense scrutiny into Crater's life revealed that he was deeply involved in the corrupt Tammany Hall machine. His judicial seat, which he had paid a massive sum to obtain, was suspected of being the result of a conspiracy. The sealed documents he had deposited and the papers he had burned were believed to contain the secrets of the payoffs and political appointments that linked him to the city's power brokers. The prime theories of his disappearance were born from this political geography: murder, that he was abducted and murdered by figures within Tammany Hall who feared his imminent testimony in corruption probes. The disposal of the body would have been immediate, professional, and designed to eliminate all trace within the complex geographical features of the city, perhaps incinerated in a furnace, sealed in a building foundation, or dumped into the Atlantic. Voluntary disappearance, that he took the sealed money and documents and simply fled the city and the country, seeking a permanent escape from the looming political exposure and financial ruin. The investigation continued for years, generating immense publicity but zero evidence. Every corner of the city, from the most public Broadway sidewalk to the deepest, most secluded alleyways, was searched. Crater's face became iconic. The only missing person in history to have his photograph pinned on the wall of the New York Police Department alongside wanted criminals. The case remained a cold, enduring urban legend for decades. The geographical secret of his end was finally given a tantalizing, if circumstantial, partial answer in 1959. A deathbed confession from a woman named Stella Ferrucci, the mistress of a small-time gangster named Frank Buffalino, claimed that Crater had been murdered by two men in a house in Coney Island, Brooklyn, and his body was buried beneath the boardwalk. This confession, though never fully substantiated, reinforced the theory that his end was violent and political. The geographical features of New York City proved to be the ultimate conspirator. The sheer size of the population, the constant flux of people, the vastness of the water surrounding Manhattan, and the professional efficiency of the organized crime world provided an almost perfect environment for a high-profile, high-stakes political disappearance. The disappearance of Judge Crater remains officially unsolved. The location of his final resting place is unknown. His case is permanently woven into the history of New York City, a symbol of the time when the city's political secrets and its physical geography were inextricably and dangerously linked. His end was a classic geographical erasure, vanishing from the brightest spot in the world, the final anonymous act in the heart of the great metropolis. Next story: the Lindbergh kidnapping, Hopewell, New Jersey, 1932. The geographical atmosphere of Hopewell, New Jersey, in the winter of 1932 was one of isolated, wealthy seclusion. The location was far removed from the clamor of the major cities, a landscape of rolling hills and dense woodlands characteristic of the Sourland mountain region. The air in the evening was cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine and frozen earth. The specific locus of the crime was the new, custom-built, large stone house of Charles and Morrow Lindbergh, situated atop a secluded hill accessible only by a single private road. The house was designed to provide the ultimate geographical privacy, a fortress against the constant, overwhelming public attention that followed the celebrated aviator. The light on the evening of Tuesday, March 1st, was minimal, the house lights shining faintly into the vast, absorbing darkness of the surrounding forest. The soundscape was typically one of profound, rural silence. On that night, the only unusual sound, reported later by a witness miles away, was a single, loud crack that could have been a tree falling or a piece of machinery. The silence of the remote location became a critical factor in the crime's execution. The victim was Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., the 20-month-old son of the famous couple. The time of the abduction was between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., a window during which the child was sleeping peacefully in his nursery on the second floor. The method of entry was audacious and relied on the geographical vulnerability of the structure. The kidnapper used a crude, homemade, three-section wooden ladder, pieced together from different types of wood, to climb to the nursery window on the second floor. The second-floor window, designed for light and air, was the single, fatal flaw in the house's otherwise fortress-like security. The kidnapper pried open the shutters and gained access to the room. The primary evidence of the crime was found immediately after the child's disappearance was discovered at 10 p.m. On the floor of the nursery, the child's parents found a ransom note, the first of many, demanding $50,000. It was poorly written, containing distinctive misspellings, and signed with a unique, interlocking symbol. The most critical physical evidence was the homemade ladder, found discarded and broken beneath the nursery window. The ladder was the key geographical artifact of the crime, a clumsy, physical link between the remote house and the anonymous outside world. The geographical isolation that the Lindberghs had sought now worked against them. The remote nature of the estate and the lack of immediate neighbors meant no one saw the intruder. The immediate, chaotic response from law enforcement and the press, however, irrevocably contaminated the scene. The geographical integrity of the grounds was destroyed by hundreds of people trampling the earth, obliterating any potential footprints or forensic traces left by the kidnapper near the ladder. The ensuing investigation and media frenzy transformed the quiet geography of Hopewell into the most famous location in the world. The ransom negotiations, conducted through a highly publicized intermediary, Dr. John F. Condon, known as JAFC, took place across the vast, anonymous geography of New York City and its suburbs. Condon communicated with the kidnapper, whose voice was described as having a slight German accent, and eventually delivered the ransom money in a graveyard in the Bronx. The kidnapper, who Condon identified as Cemetery John, gave Condon a note promising the child could be found on a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. The tip was a cruel geographical deception. The boat was nowhere to be found, and the search proved fruitless. The tragic end to the mystery came 10 weeks after the abduction. On May 12, 1932, a truck driver pulled off the main highway near Mount Rose, New Jersey, only 4 miles from the Lindbergh estate. In a shallow grave in the dense, wooded geography, he found the severely decomposed body of a small child. The location was remote, brush-filled, and within the geographical orbit of the initial crime, but deliberately concealed. Forensic examination confirmed the remains were those of Charles Lindbergh Jr., who had been killed by a massive blow to the head, likely delivered during or immediately after the abduction. The case remained cold for 2 years, despite the immense scale of the investigation. The final breakthrough came in 1934 through the tracing of the ransom money. The geographical key to the money was the gold certificates themselves. A filling station attendant in Manhattan noticed a customer paying with a gold certificate that matched the recorded serial numbers from the ransom money. The customer was Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant and carpenter living in the Bronx. The geographical coincidence was astonishing. The kidnapper lived in the same city where the ransom was paid, and his trade as a carpenter led police back to the first piece of physical evidence. The search of Hauptmann's garage, the final crime geography, revealed the undeniable evidence. Over $14,000 of the ransom money was hidden inside. The most damning evidence, however, was forensic and geographical. The wood used to construct the homemade ladder found at Hopewell was positively matched by expert wood scientist Arthur Kohler to a piece of flooring salvaged from Hauptmann's own attic in the Bronx. The piece of wood, a distinctive geographical link, served as the irrefutable evidence that connected the anonymous Manhattan carpenter to the isolated New Jersey estate. Hauptmann was brought to trial in Flemington, New Jersey. The trial was a media circus, but the forensic evidence, the ladder wood, the ransom money, and the handwriting, was overwhelming. He was convicted and executed in 1936. The Lindbergh home was eventually sold, converted into a rehabilitation center, and then became a training school. The atmosphere of rural seclusion remains, but the physical location is now institutionalized. The case stands as the most famous example of the intersection of celebrity, geographical isolation, and forensic evidence in American history. The irony is profound. A crime designed to exploit the remote, private geography of the victim's home was solved by a single, minute piece of evidence, a section of wood, that tied the killer back to the urban geographical environment he had sought to escape. Next story, the murder of Kendra Hatcher, Dallas, Texas, 2015. The geographical center of this event was the parking garage of the Gables Park 17 high-rise apartment complex in the uptown neighborhood of Dallas, Texas. This area is defined by a dense, modern urban landscape, towering glass and steel structures, high-end commerce, and the constant, rapid flow of metropolitan life. The atmosphere is one of manufactured affluence and contained, automated security. In the early evening of Wednesday, September 2nd, 2015, the air was still warm and dusty, carrying the distinct scent of hot asphalt and vehicle exhaust. Kendra Hatcher, a 35-year-old pediatric dentist, was returning to her apartment after a day of work. She was a figure of professional promise and personal stability, a representative of the successful, predictable life that the uptown area symbolized. The Gables Park 17 garage was itself a highly controlled environment, a concrete fortress accessed by key fob, designed to serve as a private, secure buffer against the chaotic life of the city outside. At approximately 7:45 p.m., Kendra Hatcher drove her Jeep Cherokee into the garage and proceeded to her assigned parking space on the 5th level. The garage was an isolated geographical space, defined by the low, echoing drone of ventilation fans, the cold, gray permanence of the concrete, and the specific, contained silence of a space designed for vehicles, not people. The assassination was executed with cold, deliberate precision. As Hatcher parked and prepared to exit her vehicle, a Jeep Grand Cherokee, which had followed her into the garage, pulled up alongside her. A lone male occupant exited the vehicle, walked directly to Hatcher's Jeep, and shot her once in the head, point blank. The entire event was over in seconds. The single, sharp sound of the gunfire, amplified by the concrete walls and low ceiling of the parking garage, was instantly absorbed by the mass of the building. The assailant then retreated back to his vehicle, which sped out of the garage and vanished into the rush hour traffic of Dallas. The discovery was made shortly after when a resident discovered Hatcher's body slumped in the vehicle. The scene was one of contained, visceral violence within the sterile, gray geometry of the parking garage. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and blood. The forensic reality was stark, a clear, purposeful execution that left no room for interpretation of motive beyond murder. The initial investigation was immediately directed by a critical piece of geographical evidence: the pervasive, cold scrutiny of the apartment complex's extensive surveillance system. Unlike a dark alley or a remote field, the Gables Park 17 garage was layered with security cameras. Investigators were quickly able to retrieve the chilling, clinical footage of the entire sequence: Hatcher's entry, the follow vehicle's immediate arrival, the precise execution, and the swift escape. This video evidence provided an immediate geographical map of the crime. The surveillance footage allowed the police to identify the make and model of the getaway vehicle and, crucially, to begin the meticulous work of tracing its journey. The investigation became a detailed geographical mapping of the vehicle's movements across the city, using traffic cameras and license plate readers. This mapping quickly led the police to the key figures involved. The murder was not a random act of street violence, but a contract killing rooted in a highly personal, specific motive. The trail led to Brenda Delgado, a former girlfriend of Hatcher's current boyfriend, a dermatologist named Ricardo Paniagua. Delgado was found to be intensely jealous and obsessed with Hatcher. The geographical network of the conspiracy was exposed. Delgado was the mastermind, offering a financial reward in the form of cash and pills to two intermediaries: Christopher Love, the triggerman, and Crystal Cortez, the getaway driver. The subsequent investigation focused on the social geography of this interconnected group, which operated outside of the affluence of Uptown. Cortez was quickly apprehended and, in exchange for a lighter sentence, provided a complete account of the plan, detailing the geographical surveillance that preceded the murder. She confessed that they had stalked Hatcher, learning her routine and selecting the parking garage for its contained, private nature, which paradoxically allowed the crime to be carried out under the lens of the one thing they didn't anticipate: high-definition cameras. The two principal co-conspirators, Christopher Love and Brenda Delgado, proved more difficult to locate. Love was arrested shortly thereafter. However, Delgado vanished entirely, crossing the border into Mexico and exploiting the vast, transnational geography of the continent to evade capture. The ensuing effort to locate Delgado introduced an international dimension to the case. She became a high-profile fugitive, placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, a geographical search that stretched from the concrete towers of Dallas to the anonymous streets of Torreon, Mexico. Her eventual capture months later, facilitated by a tip and cooperation from Mexican authorities, closed the human geography of the crime. Both Christopher Love and Brenda Delgado were ultimately tried and convicted for capital murder, with Love receiving the death penalty and Delgado a life sentence. The murder of Kendra Hatcher remains a chilling illustration of how personal obsession can penetrate and exploit the supposed invincibility of modern, protected spaces. The parking garage, designed to be a haven of security, became instead a precise, confined stage for an execution. Today, the Gables Park 17 garage maintains its sterile, gray atmosphere. The fans still drone, and the concrete walls still echo. But the air is charged with the memory of the violence that occurred in that precise, numbered space on the 5th floor. The geographical isolation of the contained space, meant to keep danger out, was ironically used to keep the victim in, ensuring a clean, brutal finality to a crime driven entirely by corrosive, external jealousy. Next story, The Pillow Pyro, Arlington, Virginia, 1980s. The suburban geography of Arlington County, Virginia, in the 1980s was characterized by a specific, dense blend of established residential neighborhoods and the rapid, anonymous growth spurred by proximity to Washington, D.C. The atmosphere was one of transient stability. Homes were generally well maintained, the streets quiet, but the population was constantly cycling, often composed of young professionals and government workers whose presence was temporary. The air, particularly in the hot, humid summer months, carried the scent of freshly cut grass, asphalt, and the distant, heavy hum of the capital city's traffic. Between the years of 1982 and 1988, this placid, predictable geography was repeatedly violated by a series of deliberate, contained acts of arson. The pattern was so unique and methodically executed that the unknown perpetrator was quickly dubbed the Pillow Pyro. The geographical targets were almost exclusively residential apartments and townhouses, particularly within the Ballston, Clarendon, and Rosslyn neighborhoods, areas defined by dense, often block-like architecture. The fires did not start randomly. They were highly specific and intimate in their ignition point, designed to exploit the very concept of domestic security. The specific modus operandi was a direct, psychological violation of the home. The perpetrator would breach the locked residence, often during the late night or early morning hours when occupants were asleep. The intrusion itself was silent and clean. There was never any sign of forced entry, suggesting the use of a bump key, a lock-picking tool, or an exploitation of the area's often lax security standards. The atmosphere of the occupied home, thick with the stale air of sleep, was quietly entered and disturbed. Once inside, the Pillow Pyro would select a bedroom, often a master bedroom. The arsonist's signature was precise. The fire was ignited on or near a bed, usually targeting a pillow or mattress, using an accelerant, often lighter fluid. The act was quick, targeted, and designed to maximize the shock of the discovery rather than simply destroy the building. The subsequent scenes were studies in localized sudden violence. The air, which had been thick with the humidity of the night, was suddenly replaced by the choking, acrid stench of smoke, melting synthetics, and burning fabric. Residents were typically awakened not by the sound of the intruder, but by the smell of the fire or the blare of the smoke alarm. They would find their most intimate space, their bed, ablaze, a horrifying realization that an anonymous presence had not only entered their home, but targeted their resting place. The geographical pattern of the crimes was erratic, yet contained. The Pillow Pyro struck dozens of times across Arlington, sometimes hitting multiple residences in a single night. The lack of any clear financial or sexual motive perplexed investigators. The crime seemed driven by a singular psychological satisfaction derived from the intimate invasion and the subsequent controlled chaos of the fire. The true motive lay buried in the psyche of the perpetrator, who exploited the anonymity of the suburban environment as both hunting ground and escape route. The investigation, carried out by the Arlington County Fire Marshal's Office and Police Department, was defined by the sheer lack of physical evidence. The heat and destruction of the fire inevitably consumed the most valuable forensic material. No definitive fingerprints, unique fibers, or usable DNA were ever recovered. The only consistent geographical clues were the pattern of the strikes and the method of ignition. The fear generated by the pillow pyro was immense and pervasive. The atmosphere of trust in the apartment complexes dissolved. Residents began sleeping with lights on, securing doors with extra measures, and often removing the very pillows and bedding that represented the heart of the killer's target. The community itself turned inward, defined by a constant, low-level anxiety that the safe geography of the home was now entirely permeable. The case remained a frustrating cold file until 1988, when the perpetrator suddenly, completely stopped. The arsonist, like a ghost, vanished as quickly and cleanly as he had entered the homes. The breakthrough, which came years later, was a product of chance and renewed focus. In 1993, while investigating an entirely different string of fires in another Virginia county, investigators received a tip leading them to Thomas Patrick Humphrey, a resident of the Arlington area. Though the initial physical evidence linking him to the pillow pyro case was weak, the psychological profile and, crucially, the specific geography of his life matched the pattern. Humphrey was a former firefighter whose training would have allowed him to enter and operate within the environment with the quiet, methodical precision of the pillow pyro. He was eventually arrested and convicted based primarily on circumstantial evidence and a detailed analysis of the geographical and temporal patterns of the fires, which aligned perfectly with his work and residence history. Today, Arlington County is even more densely developed, the anonymity of its residences intensified by the flow of people and construction. The air still smells of humidity and asphalt. The apartment buildings targeted decades ago look identical to their neighbors. But the physical geography of the place serves as a cold, tangible reminder of the crimes. The pillow pyro case stands as a chilling testament to how a methodical perpetrator can exploit the anonymity and perceived security of the modern urban suburban environment, using the intimate, contained geography of the home itself as the stage for a unique and deeply disturbing form of psychological terrorism. The lack of physical trace, coupled with the precision of the method, ensures that the atmosphere of those quiet Arlington bedrooms remains permanently tainted by the memory of fire and intrusion. Next story, the murder of Byron Carr, Rhode Island, 1988. The summer of 1988 in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, was defined by the humid coastal air, thick with the scent of salt spray, blooming hydrangeas, and the decay of low-tide mudflats. It is a quiet, historically wealthy community defined by its proximity to Narragansett Bay and the specific geography of its colonial-era architecture. Life in this town was typically a study in comfortable, predictable routine. The focus of the tragedy was the home of Byron and Jane Carr, a modest, well-maintained house on a quiet residential street, Northridge Drive, set back from the busier routes leading to the bay. Byron Carr, a respected orthopedic surgeon, was a pillar of the community, and his home provided the setting for a life of assumed safety and insulation. The night of July 21st, 1988, was warm and still, the windows of many homes open to draw in a negligible breeze. The only sounds were the distant rush of traffic on I-95 and the intermittent, shrill cries of crickets from the manicured lawns. The atmosphere was one of profound, late summer domestic calm. The silence of Northridge Drive was violently fractured just after midnight. The exact sequence of events remains locked in the fractured memories of the sole witness, Jane Carr, and the silent evidence of the scene. Byron Carr had been asleep in the master bedroom, located on the second floor. Sometime around 12:30 a.m., he was woken by an intruder. The attack was immediate and overwhelming. The perpetrator used a blunt instrument, later determined to be a heavy glass pitcher, found broken and stained at the scene. The attack was concentrated and brutal, delivered with intense, fatal force. The air in the second-floor bedroom, suddenly illuminated by the bedside lamp, was instantly thick with the metallic scent of blood and the pervasive, acrid smell of shock and adrenaline. Jane Carr, waking to the sudden, violent intrusion, found herself face-to-face with the assailant in the narrow space of the bedroom. She reported seeing a figure, a tall, powerfully built male wearing dark clothing. In the chaos of the room, she struggled with the man, her attempt at defense resulting in minor defensive injuries. The sounds of the struggle were muffled by the closed windows and the insulation of the house, swallowed by the thick night air. The perpetrator then fled, disappearing into the darkness of the East Greenwich suburb. Jane Carr immediately raised the alarm, the sound of her frantic call for help cutting sharply through the quiet of the neighborhood. The initial scene, once the police arrived, was one of shocking, visceral disarray in an environment that should have been entirely safe. Byron Carr lay dead in the master bedroom, the extent of his injuries testifying to the intense, personal nature of the assault. The forensic reality was both rich in detail and frustratingly ambiguous. Investigators immediately established that there was no sign of forced entry. The physical geography of the home suggested the assailant either entered through an unlocked door or window, or was let in. The motive was equally perplexing. The house was not ransacked. Nothing of significant value was taken, eliminating simple robbery. The violence was so specific, so concentrated on the victim, that it immediately suggested a deep, personal motive. The physical evidence gathered was substantial. The broken glass pitcher, the primary weapon, was collected, along with fingerprints lifted from the home's interior. The presence of these prints, however, immediately complicated the case. They belonged not to the perpetrator, but to Jane Carr, family members, and friends who had been in the house recently, a frustrating contamination common in domestic scenes. Crucially, no usable fingerprints belonging to an unknown assailant were ever recovered. The immediate investigation focused on the social and professional geography of Byron Carr's life, his medical practice, his relationships, and any potential adversaries. The core theory posited a revenge motive related to his work, possibly a disgruntled patient or a relative of a patient who felt wronged by a surgical outcome. This line of inquiry stretched across the entire state of Rhode Island and beyond, examining thousands of patient records and legal claims, but yielded no definitive suspects. The case remained cold for decades, defined by the failure to move past the initial physical facts and the lack of a clear motive. The narrative was continually revisited by investigators, always returning to the same frustrating point: a powerful, brutal execution in a contained, suburban home, with a witness who described an unknown, shadowy male figure. The geographical certainty, the crime happened here, on Northridge Drive, was useless without the identity of the person who breached the home's defenses. In the 2000s, the case was reopened for renewed forensic analysis. DNA technology, which was unavailable in 1988, was applied to the preserved evidence. A critical breakthrough was the development of an unknown male DNA profile from a minute bloodstain found on a towel near the scene, a stain that had gone unnoticed or unrecoverable in the initial analysis. This genetic evidence offered the first concrete geographical trace that led outside the family circle. Despite the breakthrough, the profile has never matched anyone in the National Cody's database. The suspect remains an anonymous ghost, identified only by a genetic sequence, but devoid of a name or a location in the world. Today, Northridge Drive remains a quiet, peaceful suburban street. The air is still scented with the familiar mix of grass and sea air. The house where the murder occurred is an anonymous structure, its trauma masked by new paint and the endless cycle of summer. However, The atmosphere of East Greenwich is permanently marked by the memory of the violence. The murder of Byron Carr stands as a cold testament to the fact that even the most affluent, well-insulated suburbs can have their doors silently opened to a swift, deadly intrusion. The secret remains out there, held by an unknown DNA profile and swallowed by the quiet anonymity of the suburban night. Next story, the murder of Jason Corbett, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 2015. The setting of the murder was not a dark alley or an isolated wilderness, but a modern, two-story home in the Panther Creek subdivision of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This neighborhood represents a geography of planned, predictable suburban comfort, freshly paved streets, uniform housing, and a pervasive atmosphere of middle-class tranquility. In the early hours of Sunday, August 2nd, 2015, the air was typical of a humid North Carolina summer night. Heavy, still, and carrying the faint scent of cut grass and warm asphalt. Jason Corbett, a 44-year-old Irish national, lived in this home with his second wife, Molly Martins Corbett, and his two children from his first marriage. The atmosphere within the home, however, was in deep conflict with the calm exterior, reportedly marked by increasing marital discord and tension over the custody of the children. The violence that occurred shortly after 3 a.m. was contained entirely within the master bedroom of the house. The exact sequence of events is known only through the self-serving, shifting testimony of the two individuals present, Molly Martins Corbett and her father, Thomas Martins, a retired FBI agent who was staying at the house. The silence of a suburban night was shattered by the emergency call placed at 3:06 a.m. by Thomas Martins. His voice, measured and authoritative despite the circumstances, reported a domestic incident. When the Davidson County Sheriff's deputies arrived on Northridge Drive, they were confronted with a scene of concentrated, brutal violence juxtaposed against the backdrop of a perfectly ordinary, modern bedroom. Jason Corbett lay dead on the bedroom floor, having sustained multiple, overwhelming blows to the head. The forensic reality of the room was shocking, characterized by extensive blood spatter on the walls, floors, and furniture. The air was thick with the immediate, visceral metallic scent of blood. The murder weapons were found nearby: a heavy, personalized 28-inch Louisville Slugger baseball bat and a concrete paving stone, typically used for decorative edging, which was retrieved from the bedroom floor. The use of these two common, yet devastating, blunt instruments testified to the ferocity and overkill of the attack. Thomas Martins and Molly Martins Corbett were present and outwardly cooperative. Their narrative was one of self-defense. They claimed that Jason had awoken in a rage, began choking Molly, and that Thomas Martins intervened to protect his daughter, using the bat and the paving stone only after repeated warnings and attempts to subdue him. The initial investigation was immediately defined by the physical geography of the scene and the forensic evidence. The bedroom, the isolated geographical space where the killing occurred, did not fully support the narrative of a chaotic struggle typical of spontaneous self-defense. The blood spatter patterns suggested that Jason Corbett was struck repeatedly while already on the ground, potentially after being incapacitated. His shoes were off, and he was wearing only boxer shorts, suggesting he was attacked while roused from sleep. Crucially, the official atmosphere of the investigation was fraught. The presence of Thomas Martins, a former FBI agent, introduced a layer of professional authority into the crime scene that complicated the work of the small, local sheriff's department. Statements were taken, but the physical evidence was largely accepted within the framework of the self-defense claim until the case was taken over by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. The geographical focus of the subsequent legal proceedings shifted from the suburban bedroom to the complex social and financial geography of the marriage. Prosecutors argued that the true motive was not self-defense, but Molly and Thomas Martins' desire to gain full custody of Jason's children and control his significant assets, eliminating the principal obstacle, Jason himself. Evidence pointed to Molly's increasingly desperate behavior regarding the children and Thomas Martins' intense, controlling intervention in his daughter's marriage. The trial, held in 2017, hinged not on a missing body or a secret location, but on the interpretation of the contained, physical evidence within the bedroom. The prosecution successfully argued that the level of violence, the use of two heavy weapons resulting in massive, overwhelming head trauma, far exceeded the reasonable force allowable in self-defense. They contended that Thomas Martins, trained in psychological observation, had used his authority to construct a narrative around the physical evidence. Both Molly and Thomas Martins were convicted of second-degree murder. Years later, the convictions were overturned on appeal due to the trial court's failure to admit certain evidence related to Jason Corbett's alleged history of aggressive behavior. This forced the case back into an uncertain status, defined by the enduring ambiguity of the facts. Following a plea deal, the Martinses were eventually released after a second trial was avoided, leaving the case defined by a legal compromise rather than a clear criminal verdict. Today, the house in the Panther Creek subdivision looks like any other, a large, quiet, two-story structure blending into the planned suburban geography. The air is still humid in the summer, and the sounds are only the distant noise of traffic. The physical reality of the suburban landscape remains completely passive, revealing nothing. The enduring horror of the Jason Corbett murder lies in the fact that it was carried out with maximum violence in a space designed for maximum safety. A cold act of contained, domestic brutality that permanently stained the superficial tranquility of the North Carolina suburbs. Its secrets now contained within the conflicting statements and the walls of the anonymous home. Next story, the disappearance of Jim Sullivan, Santa Rosa, New Mexico, 1980. The geography of Santa Rosa, New Mexico, is defined by the high, cold plain of the Pecos River Valley. It is a landscape of severe, stark beauty, an arid, scrub-dotted environment where the sky dominates the horizon and the dry, porous earth absorbs sound, creating a profound, echoing stillness. Route 66, the main artery through the area, provided a thin, vital thread of commerce and connection. But the moment one stepped away from the asphalt, the environment became one of vast, unforgiving emptiness. Jim Sullivan, a musician whose career was defined by spectacular highs and debilitating lows, was traversing this geography in the summer of 1980. After achieving cult success in the late 1960s with his album UFO, Sullivan's life had spiraled into financial distress and a nomadic existence. He was driving cross-country in his Volkswagen Beetle, heading toward Nashville, Tennessee, driven by the persistent, fragile hope of a career revival. The atmosphere within the vehicle would have been hot, dusty, and psychologically charged with the tension of his uncertain journey. On the morning of March 6, 1975, Sullivan's vehicle was discovered abandoned on a remote, dusty stretch of road outside Santa Rosa. The scene was one of immediate, deep strangeness. The car was not wrecked. It was simply stopped, sitting silently in the arid landscape. The engine was off, and the doors were unlocked. The key elements of the discovery were the contents. Jim Sullivan's guitar, his personal effects, money, clothing, and all of his remaining papers, including his driver's license, were found neatly secured inside the car. The geography suggested a voluntary stop, but the totality of the items left behind implied a planned return that never occurred. The official investigation was immediately hampered by the sheer, unyielding scale of the surrounding territory. The air was dry and smelled of dust and sagebrush. The physical evidence pointed nowhere. There was no struggle, no blood, and no footprints leading away from the car that were distinct enough to follow in the hard, cracked earth. The initial conclusion drawn by the local New Mexico State Police was that Sullivan had been picked up by a passing motorist, or perhaps had wandered off into the desert after a breakdown. But the complete abandonment of his professional tools and personal identity defied simple explanation. The search that followed was vast, stretching across the New Mexico high desert. Local authorities and volunteers, organized into grid patterns, combed the scrubland. The terrain itself was the primary, indifferent adversary. The landscape offered infinite places for concealment. Dry arroyos, shallow caves, and the dense, thorny scrub that could hide a man within a few feet of the road. The constant baking sun and the cold, dehydrating nights made the physical act of survival in the environment a brief, near impossible feat. The investigation quickly established that Jim Sullivan was last seen checking into the La Mesa Motel in Santa Rosa on March 4th. He had checked out the following day. A witness, the manager of the motel, reported seeing him and described him as disoriented and behaving erratically, a detail that introduced the element of psychological instability into the narrative. The geographical distance between the motel and the abandoned Beetle was short, yet the transition from the motel's manufactured comfort to the wilderness's stark reality remained a fatal, unwitnessed gap. The inquiry into the disappearance branched into a number of speculative theories, all rooted in the unique geography of the case. The first theory posited a simple, fatal desert exposure, that Sullivan, in a state of disorientation, wandered into the arid landscape to his death, his remains quickly scavenged or buried by the shifting sands. The second and more compelling theory focused on the dark, empty space of the highway, that he was intercepted by a passing vehicle, a serial killer, or a simple opportunist who saw a lone figure on the side of the road. A key detail emerged from the local folklore, adding a layer of permanent, chilling ambiguity. The abandoned car was found on a road that led to a ranch owned by a notorious local organized crime family. This introduced the possibility that Sullivan had stumbled upon or been taken in by the wrong people, an act of private, contained violence swallowed by the sheer remoteness of the ranch territory. However, this theory yielded no concrete evidence. Another dark thread of speculation involved the manager of the La Mesa Motel, who was rumored to have had connections to local organized crime, and whose immediate, intense involvement in the subsequent search was seen by some as an attempt to control the narrative. This led to a brief, frustrating period of investigation focusing on the small, tightly controlled social geography of Santa Rosa itself. Decades passed, and the case settled into its permanent, unsolved status. The physical evidence, the car, the guitar, the personal effects, remains the only certainty. The absence of the body, the complete vanishing act, solidified the mystery. Jim Sullivan's UFO album and its themes of alien abduction and cosmic disappearance were later linked to his real-life fate by fans, creating a powerful, unsettling resonance between his art and his unresolved vanishing act into the New Mexico desert. Today, Santa Rosa is still defined by the intersection of the highway and the enormous, empty landscape. The air is still dry and silent. The vast, indifferent geography of the high plain continues to hold the only secret. The disappearance of Jim Sullivan stands as a stark testament to the power of the American desert, a landscape of such overwhelming scale and emptiness that a man can simply step out of his car and dissolve, leaving behind only his tools and identity, a phantom absorbed entirely by the dust, the sagebrush, and the unending, cold silence of the Pecos Valley. Next story, the Marilyn Shepard murder, Bay Village, Ohio, 1954. The summer air along the shores of Lake Erie in 1954 was heavy with the scent of damp vegetation, fresh-cut grass, and the faint, constant ozone aroma of the vast, cold body of water. Bay Village, Ohio, was then and remains a community defined by its quiet affluence and deliberate isolation from the urban sprawl of Cleveland. It was a place of deep, almost enforced tranquility, characterized by wide lawns, two-story frame and brick homes, and the low, steady sound of the lake's surf against the shale beach. The Shepherd home on Lake Road was typical of this milieu. Large, well-maintained, and situated directly across from the lake, offering an endless, shifting view of the horizon. Marilyn Shepard, 31, was pregnant with her second child, a fact that added a layer of anticipatory stillness to the household. Her husband, Dr. Sam Shepard, an osteopathic surgeon, embodied the post-war ideal of success and civic responsibility. The evening of Sunday, July 4th, was marked by the comfortable sounds of suburban domesticity, the faint pop of distant fireworks across the lake, The gentle whir of the window fan drawing in the lake air, and the murmur of conversation from the living room, where the Shepherds were hosting neighbors for an evening of quiet socializing. The atmosphere was one of profound, conventional security. The neighbors departed shortly before midnight. Dr. Shepard reported falling asleep on the downstairs couch while watching television, a common summer practice. Marilyn went upstairs to the master bedroom, located in the southeast corner of the house, where the air was slightly warmer and closer. The house settled into the specific quiet of a sleeping summer residence, a silence broken only by the mechanical hum of the refrigerator and the gentle rush of the lake water outside. The specific, kinetic violation of this peace remains the core of the mystery. Sometime between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. on July 5th, the attack occurred. The exact sounds, the number of assailants, and the timing of the events are known only through the fractured, often conflicting testimony of the lone survivor. The first sound of the new day was the frantic, panic call from Dr. Shepard to his neighbor, the mayor of Bay Village, J. Spencer Houck, at 5:40 a.m. His voice was ragged, almost incomprehensible, conveying a single, horrifying fact. Marilyn was dead. The arrival of the mayor and his wife, Esther, shattered the silence of Lake Road. The initial scene was one of extreme, visceral disarray. Dr. Shepard was found disheveled, injured, and in a state of shock, his clothing torn and a large bruise marking his neck. He reported waking to a scream, rushing upstairs, confronting a bushy-haired man in the dim light of the bedroom, and being knocked unconscious. He claimed to have awoken a second time, pursued the intruder toward the lake, struggled with him on the beach, and was rendered unconscious again. The master bedroom, however, was the true epicenter of the nightmare, a room violently transformed. The air inside was heavy and metallic. Marilyn Shepard's body lay diagonally across the twin beds, her face unrecognizable due to the sheer brutality of the assault. The forensic reality of the scene was a study in shocking, concentrated violence. Blood was everywhere, spattered across the walls, soaked into the bedding, and coating the room in a fine, macabre mist. A pillow lay partially covering her face, and her clothing had been pushed up. The violence suggested a frenzied, powerful attack using a blunt instrument. The physical evidence was compelling, but immediately compromised. The house was swiftly overrun by neighbors, police, and officials, all tramping through the scene before adequate preservation could be achieved. This lack of control was an irreversible contamination. Crucial details, like a small, leather-bound zipper bag and a wristwatch found near the water's edge, were handled haphazardly. The initial investigation fixated immediately and almost exclusively on the surviving occupant, Dr. Sam Shepard. The police, led by the chief of police, John Eaton, approached the case with an immediate, deep-seated skepticism toward the doctor's narrative of the bushy-haired intruder. This focus was amplified by the local media, which, led by the powerful Cleveland press, engaged in a relentless campaign of accusation and public pressure, painting Shepard as the prime suspect. The atmosphere shifted from seeking an external killer to prosecuting a husband who had failed to meet the accepted standard of grief and credibility. The key forensic details, which should have guided the investigation, were instead used to build the case against Shepard. The pattern of the blood spatter on the walls suggested the assailant was standing over the victim, delivering multiple blows. The fact that the blood patterns on Shepard's clothing did not correlate with an attack he described, i.e., less spatter than expected, was used by the prosecution to suggest he had cleaned himself or changed clothes. Yet, counter-evidence existed that pointed away from him. A blood smear of unknown type was found on the guest room wall. A human tooth fragment was recovered from the rug, yet its origin could not be definitively traced to either Sam or Marilyn. A small, distinctive piece of blue surgical gauze was found near the body, a detail never adequately explained. Most importantly, the murder weapon, the heavy, blunt instrument used in the attack, was never recovered, leaving a gaping void in the physical evidence. The subsequent trial was a national sensation, defined by its circus-like atmosphere. The jury was not sequestered. allowing the intense, pervasive media coverage to color every piece of testimony. Shepherd was convicted, a verdict driven largely by public pressure, the failure of his own credibility, and the absence of any other convincing suspect. A decade later, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the conviction, citing the carnival atmosphere of the trial and the prejudicial media exposure. This decision led to a second trial in 1966, where Dr. Shepherd was ultimately acquitted. The acquittal returned the case to its original status, an unsolved homicide, leaving the physical reality of the Bay Village home as the only certainty. The Shepherd House on Lake Road was eventually torn down. The site is now occupied by a new structure, but the geography itself cannot be erased. The air, particularly in the quiet of the pre-dawn hours, is still thick with the constant, rhythmic sound of the lake's surf, the last cold, silent witness to the violence. The mystery endures in the details that remain unresolved. The identity of the person with the bushy hair, the unknown surgical gauze, and the missing murder weapon. The tranquility of Bay Village, once a perfect shield of suburban security, became the perfect cover for an act of supreme, concentrated brutality, its atmospheric silence having swallowed the truth whole, leaving only the echo of a scream across the cold surface of Lake Erie. Next story, the Lake Oconee Murders, Georgia, 2014. The geography of Lake Oconee, Georgia, is defined by its serene, manufactured beauty. Created by the Wallace Dam on the Oconee River, the lake is a sprawling dendritic network of waterways fringed by the manicured lawns and high-end retirement communities of Georgia's lake country. In the summer of 2014, the air was hot, thick, and intensely humid, carrying the scent of pine needles, wet earth, and the faint, sweet smell of water hyacinth blooming on the lake surface. This environment projected an atmosphere of privileged, predictable leisure, a place where the greatest danger was usually the sun or the wake of a speeding boat. Shirley and Russell Dermond, both in their 80s, were fixtures in the Great Waters community, living in a secluded home situated on a peninsula, granting them a generous, sweeping view of the lake. Their life was one of routine contentment, morning walks, quiet evenings, and the gentle rhythm of retirement. Their house, a substantial structure of wood and stone, sat back from the water, accessed by a long, curving driveway that served as a natural barrier to the outside world. The first crack in this calm surfaced over the weekend of May 3rd, when the Dermonds failed to appear at their usual social events. Calls went unreturned. This was profoundly uncharacteristic for the highly dependable couple. The atmosphere among their concerned neighbors and friends shifted from casual worry to a deepening unease, a silent, gathering anxiety that was at odds with the sunny tranquility of the lake. On Tuesday, May 6th, the alarm was definitively raised. A neighbor, granted access to the property, drove the long, tree-lined driveway toward the house. The setting was initially untouched. The mailbox was full, the garage doors were closed, and the cars were parked inside. The house projected an atmosphere of simple, temporary absence. But upon entering the house through the unlocked garage, the atmosphere became immediately horribly cold. Russell Dermond was discovered in the garage, near the entrance to the house. The scene was clinical and contained. He had been killed by a forceful blow to the head, delivered by an unknown blunt instrument. The attack was concentrated and lethal. The air in the garage, a mix of gasoline fumes, dust, and the stale heat of the closed space, was now overlaid with a sharp, metallic note. A detailed search of the house revealed no signs of forced entry. The windows were secured, the doors were locked, and the alarm system was reportedly off. The interior of the house was not ransacked. Valuables, including jewelry and cash, lay undisturbed, negating the primary motive of simple robbery. The physical environment of the home suggested that the victims had either known their assailants or had allowed them inside under circumstances that did not trigger alarm. The violence had been brought in from outside, but the resistance had been zero. The most disturbing fact, however, was not the death of Russell Dermond, but the absence of his wife, Shirley. She was nowhere in the house. Her purse, wallet, keys, and cell phone were all found inside, suggesting she had been taken unexpectedly and quickly. The sheer stillness of the house, now under the intense glare of police floodlights, amplified the emptiness left by her disappearance. The investigation, centered in Putnam County, Georgia, immediately commenced a desperate, large-scale search. The central geographical focus became Lake Oconee itself. Boats equipped with sonar equipment tirelessly crisscrossed the vast 19,000-acre network of waterways. Helicopters flew low over the dense forests and shoreline. The atmosphere of the quiet, wealthy community was suddenly shattered by the constant, mechanical sounds of the search efforts. The whine of the boat engines, the thump of the helicopter rotors, and the measured, authoritative voices of the law enforcement personnel. The community's previous sense of insulated safety dissolved into pervasive, cold fear. For 10 days, the mystery of Shirley Derman's location deepened. The investigators had few leads beyond the physical evidence in the home, which largely suggested an attack launched by a controlled, purposeful actor. There was no apparent motive, no financial distress, no known enemies, and no apparent connection to any criminal element. The case settled into a painful stasis, with the lake holding onto its secret. The stasis was broken on Friday, May 16th, by a fisherman. Approximately 7 miles from the Derman's home, in a quiet, less-trafficked cove, he discovered a body floating near the shoreline, caught in the reeds. It was Shirley Derman. The recovery scene introduced the final, crucial piece of evidence. Shirley had been killed by 2 distinct blows to the head, delivered with the same blunt force used to kill her husband. She had no defensive wounds. Importantly, her body was found anchored by a cinder block tied with a rope, suggesting a planned, premeditated attempt to sink her in the deep water. The cinder block and the rope became the most critical, yet ultimately unyielding, pieces of physical evidence. Commonplace objects that gave no immediate indication of who had used them. The discovery only deepened the ambiguity of the case's purpose. Was Russell killed inside the home, and Shirley taken by boat to be disposed of in a remote cove, miles away? If the initial motive was personal vengeance or a calculated hit, why leave behind a body so close to the lake's surface, and why leave the home untouched? Years have passed since the discovery. The case remains cold. The geographical evidence, the wide-open water, the vastness of the shoreline, the limited ingress and egress of the peninsula home, suggested a crime of opportunity that required intimate, specific knowledge of the victims and the location. The lake itself, vast and often murky, swallowed the final piece of evidence. The boat used to transport Shirley Derman, the specific nature of the murder weapon, and the identities of the assailants. Today, Lake Oconee continues its cycle of predictable leisure. The sun still beats down on the water, and the speedboats still cut their bright wakes across the surface. The Derman home is gone, replaced by another structure, erasing the immediate physical memory of the crime. Yet, the air above the water remains subtly changed. The vast, humid expanse of the lake, once a symbol of retreat and safety, now holds the enduring, cold secret of 2 violent acts. A geography of tranquil beauty that proved to be the perfect, silent accomplice to murder and disappearance. The perfect place for a crime to be swallowed by the anonymity of the water. Next story, the disappearance of Melanie Ethier, Lac Tuc, Quebec, 1997. The town of Lac Tuc, Quebec, is embedded deep within the vast, ancient geography of the Morrissey region. It is a place dominated by 2 powerful, contrasting elements: the mighty, dark-running St. Maurice River and the seemingly infinite, dense expanse of the Canadian boreal forest. In the late summer and early autumn of 1997, the air was intensely cold and crisp, carrying the sharp, pervasive scent of pine, birch, and the damp, metallic aroma of the cold river water. The atmosphere was one of profound geographical isolation, where human presence felt transient against the monumental scale of the surrounding wilderness. Melanie Ethier, 15, lived a typical, if constrained, life in this remote community. The social geography of La Tuque was small and familiar. Everyone knew everyone, and life proceeded with a certain predictability dictated by the seasons and the limited terrain. On the evening of October 2nd, a Thursday, Melanie had spent the evening socializing with friends. The town's nightlife revolved around a small circuit of familiar, brightly lit gathering spots. The final confirmed sighting of Melanie occurred in the early hours of Friday, October 3rd, around 1 a.m. She was seen walking alone, heading south along Route 155, the main road that serves as the town's spine and its only real connection to the outside world. This walk, a routine trek home from her friend's house, was the last time she was observed. The road was dimly lit, flanked on one side by the closed facades of the town's outer limits, and on the other by the sudden, deep darkness of the encroaching wilderness. Melanie was last seen near the intersection of St. Joseph and Lac St. Louis streets. She was wearing light-colored clothes, a light-colored sweater and jeans, making her a visible yet solitary figure against the cold, dark landscape. After passing a few final houses, the geography of her route became overwhelmingly one of forest, empty road, and the constant, subtle roar of a nearby river. She simply vanished into the brief, dark passage between her last known point and her home. The discovery of her disappearance was characterized by the small town's immediate and coordinated sense of alarm. The atmosphere of La Tuque shifted instantly from quiet routine to intense, communal anxiety. The Sûreté du Québec, SQ, launched an immediate investigation, but the initial, critical hours were hampered by the lack of any struggle, blood, or disturbance. The physical evidence pointed to an act of pure, silent removal. The geographical scale of the subsequent search was immense, quickly overwhelming the resources of the local police. The focus was the vast, brutal wilderness surrounding the town. Search efforts, involving hundreds of police officers, volunteers, and trained search and rescue teams, were concentrated on the periphery of La Tuque. The air was filled with the rhythmic calls of searchers and the heavy scent of disturbed moss and damp boreal earth. Investigators painstakingly mapped the terrain. The dense, impassable thickets of spruce and fir, the deep, cold ravines that run off the river, and the miles of abandoned logging roads that snake invisibly into the forest. The St. Maurice River became a primary, indifferent suspect. Its cold, fast-moving current and immense depth offered the perfect geographical disposal mechanism. Boats and sonar equipment probed the dark water, but the river, fed by the glacial melt of the north, refused to yield its secrets. The investigative geography of the case quickly extended outward, searching for a trace of the vehicle that must have been used to effect her disappearance. The theory was solidified. Melanie was almost certainly intercepted on Route 155, the only viable route of travel and escape. The perpetrator was likely a driver, using the isolation of the road in the darkest hours of the night as an opportunity. The key to the case lay in identifying a vehicle and tracing the one specific, momentary human intrusion into the wilderness's vast anonymity. Despite thousands of man-hours spent searching and interviewing, the case settled into a painful, persistent cold status. The forensic reality was negligible. No piece of clothing, no personal item, and no definitive witness to an abduction was ever located. The sheer lack of physical evidence contrasted starkly with the geographical certainty that she was taken from a specific, small stretch of road. The investigation has been periodically reopened over the decades, driven by new forensic techniques or the faint hope of a deathbed confession. Each new search returns to the same unyielding landscape, the vast, indifferent forest and the cold, relentless river. Leads have involved known local figures, drifters, and transient workers who pass through the town, but none have ever yielded the definitive location of the victim. Today, La Tuque remains a small, isolated town, surrounded by the same dark, deep forest. Route 155 continues its long, straight run, flanked by the silence of the trees. The atmosphere of the town, though outwardly returned to routine, is permanently marked by the geographical uncertainty of the disappearance. The Canadian wilderness, in its brutal indifference and overwhelming scale, acted as the perfect accomplice. It swallowed a body without leaving a trace, maintaining a profound, cold silence that no amount of human effort has been able to penetrate. The physical truth of Melanie Ethier's final moments remains trapped somewhere in the vast, dense, cold expanse of the Morrissey Forest, a permanent, unresolved mystery anchored to the silent river. Next story, the disappearance of Alexis Gabe, Antioch, California, 2022. The setting of the disappearance was Antioch, California, a city situated at the eastern edge of the San Francisco Bay Area, where the suburban sprawl gives way to the vast, flat expanse of the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta. In the geography of this place, the atmosphere is often warm and dry, scented with dust and the faint, cold, persistent smell of the brackish delta water. The area is defined by its anonymous residential streets, large commercial hubs, and the hidden, winding waterways that lead into the massive delta system. Alexis Gabe, 24, was last seen on the evening of Wednesday, January 26, 2022. She had been visiting her ex-boyfriend, Marshall Jones, at his apartment on Trenton Street in Antioch. The nature of their relationship was strained but contained within the defined, anonymous space of the apartment complex. Sometime after 11 p.m., Alexis left the apartment. The silence of the suburban night, usually broken only by the distant sounds of traffic, absorbed her final movements. Her disappearance was only discovered the following morning, when she failed to arrive at work. The initial investigation centered on a chilling discovery near her home. Her car, a white 2017 Honda Accord, was found abandoned a few blocks away. The scene was immediately ambiguous. The car was unlocked, the keys were missing, and the interior suggested a clean departure. The atmosphere around the vehicle was one of manufactured normalcy that masked a profound underlying terror. However, forensic analysis quickly revealed a critical, violent discord. Evidence of a significant amount of blood, later confirmed to be Alexis's, was found inside the vehicle, concentrated around the passenger side. This finding immediately elevated the case from a simple missing person investigation to a deliberate, violent crime. The quiet streets of the Antioch suburb had been the geographical stage for an assault. The focus of the investigation turned entirely to Marshall Jones. The police, utilizing the geographical data of the suspect's movements, began mapping his mobile phone and vehicle records. This geographical tracing introduced the massive, cold, indifferent scale of the Delta region into the narrative. The phone data indicated that immediately following Alexis's departure, Jones's phone had traveled an unusual, extensive geographical path through the Central Valley, moving far east of Antioch and lingering in various remote, sparsely populated areas. The atmosphere around these data points was one of intense, purposeful activity in the darkest hours of the night. This complex geographical mapping led the investigators to focus their search on the vast, isolated areas near Pioneer, California, in Amador County, a mountain geography far removed from the flat suburbia of Antioch. This area is characterized by dense, rugged terrain, steep inclines, and deep, dark river canyons, a landscape perfectly designed for the concealment of evidence. The subsequent search efforts, involving hundreds of personnel, search dogs, and specialized technology, were physically grueling. The air was dry and cold, scented with mountain pine and dry earth. The teams painstakingly combed the remote areas identified by the phone data, focusing on specific geographical markers like ditches, ravines, and remote turnouts. The scale of the search was immense, but the results were negligible. The investigation took a sharp turn 5 months later when, facing overwhelming circumstantial and geographical evidence, police moved to apprehend Marshall Jones. During the attempt, Jones was fatally shot by police after allegedly confronting them with a weapon. His death, while ending the immediate investigation into him, created an enduring geographical void. The only person who knew the precise location of Alexis's body was now gone. Despite the loss of the key witness, The police continued to use the recovered digital geographical data, the specific cell tower pings, and vehicle GPS points to focus their search. The search efforts repeatedly returned to the same unyielding geography of the Central Valley foothills. The case remained agonizingly poised between conviction and location until February 2023, more than a year after the disappearance. Following a renewed, concentrated search of a geographical area in Pioneer, searchers found small, fragmented human remains along a remote creek bank. Subsequent DNA testing confirmed the remains were those of Alexis Gabe. The discovery was partial, but definitive. The geographical location, deep in the mountainous terrain, far from the site of the abduction, confirmed the methodical, desperate lengths taken to conceal the crime. The creek bank, cold, shadowed, and remote, was the ultimate resting place, a spot chosen for its complete geographical anonymity. Today, Antioch remains a quiet, predictable suburb. The apartment complex on Trenton Street is anonymous. Its atmosphere returned to the routine of daily life. The true atmosphere of the case resides far eastward in the vast, silent, mountainous geography of Amador County. The high, cold ravines and the running creek water remain the final, silent witnesses to the disposal. The disappearance of Alexis Gabe stands as a testament to the power of a determined killer to use the sheer, indifferent scale of California's hidden geography to try and permanently swallow a violent crime. Next story, The Lady of the Dunes, Provincetown, Massachusetts, 1974. Imagine the tip of Cape Cod in the height of midsummer. The air is thick with the scent of salt spray, sun-warmed beach grass, and the faint, sweet aroma of wild roses blooming in the dunes. Provincetown, in July of 1974, was a place of vibrant light and shifting sands, a haven for artists, wanderers, and those seeking the solace of the Atlantic. The sound of the ocean is a constant, rhythmic pulse, a deep bass note that underlies the cries of the gulls and the distant laughter from the town's bustling wharves. Yet, out in the Race Point Dunes, far from the reach of the street lamps and the crowded inns, the landscape is a quiet, rolling desert of pale gold, where the wind reshapes the earth every hour and the tracks of the day are erased by the evening tide. On a bright afternoon on July 26th, a young girl walking her dog through these remote dunes stumbled upon a sight that would freeze the summer air. Tucked into the hollow of a dune, lying on a blue and rust-colored beach towel, was a woman who seemed to be resting. She was face down, her head resting on a folded pair of Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana. But as the dog drew closer, the stillness became unnatural. The woman had been there for some time, her body resting in the cradle of the sand, yet she carried no identification. She had no name. She was, from that moment on, the Lady of the Dunes. To the investigators who walked through the soft sand that day, she was a specter of the summer, a woman who had come to the end of the road where the land meets the sea. The investigation began under the scorching glare of the Cape Cod sun. The lady was estimated to be between 20 and 40 years old, with auburn hair pulled back into a ponytail. Her presence in the dunes was a riddle written in the sand. There were no signs of struggle. No footprints led directly to the spot that hadn't already been brushed away by the relentless coastal wind. The autopsy revealed a tragic violence. Her hands had been removed, and several of her teeth were missing, a deliberate attempt by someone to ensure she remained a shadow. Yet, despite the darkness of her end, she was treated with a strange, domestic care. She lay on her side as if asleep, her head cushioned, looking toward the vast, blue expanse of the Atlantic. For decades, the mystery of the Lady of the Dunes became a part of the local folklore, a quiet tragedy discussed in the winter months when the tourists had gone and the wind howled through the shutters of the town. Detectives looked through thousands of missing persons files, tracing women from as far as California and Canada. They looked into the local transient community and the seasonal workers who arrived with the heat and vanished with the frost. In one of the most famous and unusual leads, some researchers wondered if she might have been an extra in the film Jaws, which was filming just across the water on Martha's Vineyard that same summer. They scanned the background of crowd scenes, looking for a woman in a blue bandana, hoping to catch a glimpse of her alive, moving through the vibrant light of a cinematic summer. The sand continued to shift, and the years turned into nearly half a century of silence. The lady was buried in a small cemetery in Provincetown, her headstone marked only with the date of her discovery. The town never forgot her. Residents would often leave small stones or wildflowers on her grave, a communal gesture of empathy for a woman who died among them as a stranger. The case remained a cold, haunting weight on the community, a reminder that the ocean keeps many secrets. Then, in the quiet of late 2022, the modern world finally reached back through time. Through the delicate science of forensic genealogy, the Lady of the Dunes was given her name back, Ruth Marie Terry. Ruth was a daughter of Tennessee, a woman who had traveled across the country, perhaps seeking a new beginning on the edge of the world. Knowing her name provided a somber closure, yet it left the mystery of her final walk into the dunes intact. We imagine her now, not as a victim, but as a woman breathing in the salt air of Race Point. Perhaps she watched the sunset turn the white sand to shades of lavender and pink. Perhaps she found a moment of profound peace in the rhythmic sound of the waves before the shadows grew long.